Okay, great. So, welcome everyone. So excited to see all of you this morning or this afternoon. We're here to introduce Maryrose Weatherton. First, we'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge the land on which University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And today it's still a meeting place and home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. And we're very grateful to have the opportunity to work and study on this land. And without further ado, let me introduce our speaker today. Maryrose Weatherton is an amazing PhD candidate at the University of Knoxville, Tennessee, and was named National Science Foundation Graduate Fellow in 2020. She's interested in student outcomes and resource use in STEM fields, and today we'll be discussing with us her research in this area and implications for student resource use in STEM at the institutional level with regard to decision-making, mentoring, and future applications of her findings. And so, without further ado, I will pass it over to you, Maryrose.
All right, thank you so much, Erin. Let me just pull my screen up. Can you all give me a thumbs up if you can see that? Awesome. All right, well, thank you. Yes, like Erin said, my name is Maryrose. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Tennessee, and I am within the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. So today, I am going to be talking with you all about graduate student resource use. Now, before we start, let's say that a resource can be anything, any person, object, or place that helps one accomplish a goal. And today we're going to dive into this world of resources, and I'll show you what resources life science graduate students are using, why they're using these resources, and then how those resource uses differ by demographic characteristics. And then finally, we'll conclude with where I think these results can be applied to issues of equity within higher education. So I started to become interested in resource use when I studied plant communities in tropical rainforests. And in this context, it's really clear what resources plants need. They need water, sunlight, and nutrients. And we know that the success of any given plant is based partially on their ability to acquire and utilize these resources. And when I came to graduate school, I hypothesized that really similar dynamics might exist within graduate student communities. Tropical trees need sunlight to grow big and strong, and graduate students need social and monetary support to finish their degrees. But just like in ecological communities, we know that within academic communities, resources are not equally distributed. This unequal distribution and use of resources may be related to the unequal success and persistence that we see within graduate programs. So, for example, within the life sciences specifically, in 2020, we know that only 6% of life science doctoral degrees were awarded to Black US citizens, who make up 13% of the United States population. Similarly, only 8% of life science doctoral degrees were awarded to Hispanic or Latino citizens, who make up 18% of the US population. So we're seeing a lot of these gaps in between doctoral degree awards and the proportion of these people that make up the population. And that points to some sort of inequity that happens in the system. And so, if student resource use may be connected to students' persistence and success within their graduate programs, and persistence and success within these programs is currently inequitable, then resources and resource use may be integral tools to begin to address issues of inequity within STEM higher education. However, we lack answers to even basic questions about graduate student resource use. So the studies that I'm going to talk to you about today set out to explore some very basic questions. Specifically, we're going to talk today about 3 research objectives. The first of which was just to describe life science graduate students' resource use in terms of how many resources they're using and how frequently they're using them. The second objective was to explore why life science graduate students choose to use certain resources over others. And then finally, we're going to examine the relationships between resource use and student demographic characteristics. So broadly, my work uses expectancy value theory as its theoretical framework. Now, EVT posits that student choices are proximally affected by their expectations and values, and distally affected by many variables, including their demographic characteristics and past experiences. So here's that full EVT model, and we can see that there's a ton of variables in this model. But for today's talk, what we're going to focus on is these variables boxed in blue on the right-hand side and the variables boxed in yellow on the left-hand side. Now, these variables boxed in blue are going to represent our dependent variables that we're looking at in these studies, which include number of resources that students are using, how frequently they're using them, and then how they perceive resource value. In terms of the independent variables that we're going to be looking at today, these are those demographic factors like gender and racial identity, year in program, and college generation status. And college generation status just refers to whether or not a student identifies as a first or continuing generation college student. So the data that we're going to talk about today were collected using a national survey of life science graduate students that was distributed electronically during the fall of 2021. Our final sample size included 534 life science graduate students who represented more than 80 institutions nationwide. And at the bottom of this slide, you can see the characteristic demographic breakdown of our participants. So this survey began with a list of 34 resources, and participants were asked to select all of the resources from this list that they used in their programs. So here's that list on this slide, and we can see that these resources are broken down by categories, including resources related to academic support, institutionally provided resources, monetary resources, resources that relate to students' career networks, and then both social academic and social non-academic resources. So students were given this big old list and they were asked to select all of the resources that they used. And then those selections carried through to the next couple of questions, one of which asked students to select how often they used each of those resources from infrequently to frequently. Those selections were then assigned scores of 1 through 5, where 5 indicated a very frequent use. And then we ran descriptive statistics for each resource's frequency of use. So in terms of understanding how many resources students are using, we simply summed the number of resources that each student said that they used. And what we can see is that on average, students are using about 19.4 resources with a standard deviation of about 5.6. Now, this is many more resources than we were suspecting, and we can see that there's quite a big range here. So we know that students are generally using many resources, though some students are not using very many at all. In order to describe how frequently students used these resources, we calculated each resource's mean frequency of use, which is what you're going to see here on the y-axis, again, where 5 indicates a very frequent use. And our x-axis here is each of those 34 resources. The other thing you're going to see is that the bars here are going to be color-coded by those categories of resource use. So this is what we found in terms of resources' average frequency of use, and this is a lot of data to look at, so I'm just going to point out some of the really important takeaways here. The first of which is these top 3 most important resources, or most frequently used resources, rather. And these were academic stipend, online academic journals, and electronic resources. Now, each of these resources plays a role in fulfilling students' basic needs. Academic stipends obviously help to pay for rent, food, and so on. And academic support resources like online journals and electronic resources help students maintain their positions in their programs and provide material support that students need day to day. The next big thing I want to point out is this huge block of social resources. So after those top 3 most frequently used resources, we've got both social academic and social non-academic resources that were used the next most frequently. And this shows that students are relying on their social support networks a ton day to day. The last thing I want to point out here is which resources were not used super frequently. So when we look at the bottom 50% of this chart, we're seeing a lot of those light blue bars. And again, those are those institutionally provided resources. So this is an interesting finding just because we know how much institutions spend on making sure these resources are available and accessible to students, things like university events, university-sponsored workshops, and career centers. However, what we see is that graduate students, at least, are not using them super frequently. So now that we know what resources students are using, let's dive into why they might be using these resources. So if you'll remember from the beginning of the talk, we're using expectancy value theory, which posits that an individual's expectations and values work together to determine resource use outcomes. So we hypothesize that learning more about students' expectations and their values for each resource might help us understand why they're utilizing some resources over others. And for today's talk, I'm going to tell you about one of these concepts, students' perceptions of value, and how that might be influencing their resource use outcomes. So we asked students to choose their top 3 most important resources from that list of 34. And then we asked them with a free response box to explain to us why those resources were so important to them. Now, I want to note a bit of language here. You'll notice that we're asking about resource importance and not resource value. So pilot testing helped us write these survey questions, and we found that the concept of importance was much easier for students to understand than the concept of value. So just note that when you see importance today, we're referring to participants' perception of resource value. In today's talk, those two are going to mean the same thing. Okay, so after that note, let's talk about what we found. So we analyzed all of students' free response answers to the question, please describe why you feel these resources are important. And to analyze those responses, we used standard inductive qualitative methods to code those free responses. Using a 2-person coding team, we developed 9 codes that were sorted into 2 themes, and our final inter-rater agreement was about 86%, which is higher than the 70% standard for the field. So the 2 themes that we found were resource attributes and help provided. Now, resource attributes described participants' perceptions of the characteristics or nature of the resource that made it valuable to them. And the codes that we found within this theme were availability, validity, and essential. Now, availability described how available a resource was to a participant. For example, participants often said their advisor was always available to answer their questions. Validity referred to how likely the students thought that the resource was to give them the correct information. So this came from resources that they knew could give them the right answers to the questions they were looking for. And then essential described the indispensable or required nature of a resource. And a quote that really nicely represents this essential nature is this one here, where a participant is talking about their academic stipend, and a participant said, without the stipend, I would not be in school. Without it, a PhD was not affordable in our case. So again, this is just talking about some aspect of how the resource is that helps participants achieve those goals. So our second theme was help provided, and help provided was coded whenever participants described what they used a resource for or what the resource provided to them. So these responses were talked about in terms of very concrete benefits that participants derived from these resources. So some of the codes under the help provided theme included basic need, connection, academic, persistence, support, and well-being. Now, many responses, especially under this help provided theme, represented multiple codes, like this response, which says, with a good advisor, it won't matter what the institution provides, they'll help you find the resources you need, they'll make sure you're on track, and they'll support you through it all. So this response covered the connection, persistence, and support codes. So we saw a lot of codes within this help provided theme. So in terms of how these themes mapped onto the resources in our study, we've got this graph here where the x-axis is going to show us what percent of student free responses were coded under the resource attribute theme, which is in orange here, and what percent of the responses for each resource were coded under the help provided theme in blue. So the y-axis is going to show us each of our 34 resources in just a second, but a big broad picture here that we can see is that most of these bars are mostly blue, which indicates that most of our resources, when participants were talking about why they were important, they were most often talking about what benefits they received from this resource, as opposed to how the resource was or what attributes drove their value. So once we put those resource names on there, we can see that most of these resources, again, are still being described in terms of the help that the resource provides, but those top 3 resources that are most often described in terms of resource attributes were the University Transit System, travel funds, and the University Career Center. Now, I don't have a great reason why those 3 were described most often in terms of resource attributes, but I'd love to discuss that with you after my talk today. So keep that one in your mind for later. But now that we know that resources are most often used because of the help that they provide, let's dive deeper into that theme specifically and look at how frequent those help provided codes were across our data set. So this table is going to show us the number of times that a code was used in our data set and its overall prevalence within the help provided theme, but I've been talking for quite a bit, so I want to hear from you all. So before I reveal this whole table, I want you all to predict in the chat which codes you think were most prevalent in our data set. So take about 30 seconds now, and then we'll move on and we'll see if you're right. So those 30 seconds are going to start right now. All right, I'm seeing some responses come in. Okay, basic needs, that definitely represents what we saw within terms of frequency of use. Okay, so lots of good answers. Let's see if you all were correct. So what we can see is that these codes are ranked in order of their most to least prevalent within our data set. So academic was the most prevalent, followed by support and well-being codes. And then further down, we've got basic needs, persistence, and connection. And this makes sense, right? These are graduate students within an academic program. And so the thing that they're using resources for most commonly is to fulfill some of these academic needs. And then after that, we know that the next most important thing to most graduate students is developing as a scholar. So they're getting those support, guidance, and mentoring resources next. And then they're maintaining their mental health, which is what that well-being code kind of talks about. So really good guesses. And I'd love to talk more, like I said, after this about why you had each of those predictions. So let's take a second and think about what we've learned so far today. So in terms of our first research question, we found that students use a ton of resources in their programs, but those that support their basic needs and day-to-day life were used most frequently. After that, we found that students, why they're using these resources, their perception of value is driven primarily by the concrete benefits that they gained from each resource, and that academic help and mentoring support were the most frequently cited benefits as to why participants are choosing to use these resources. So now that we know the general trends of student resource use, let's move into a more detailed examination. Specifically, instead of looking at students as a monolith, we're going to be examining these same resource use outcomes and how they might differ across demographic groups. So to examine the relationship between the number of resources that students are using and their demographic characteristics, I ran a generalized linear model with a Poisson link function and demographic characteristics as my predictor variables. So again, those demographic characteristics that we collected in this survey were gender identity, racial identity, year in program, and college generation status. And so after running this model, what we found is that women, there we go. Women reported using significantly more resources than men. Non-white students reported using significantly more resources than white students. Year was significantly related to the number of resources used, with a general trend that as year in program increased, the number of resources that students used decreased. And then finally, we found that there was no significant difference in the number of resources used by first and continuing generation students. Okay, so those are all our results in terms of number of resources used. We can see that demographics are pretty important in terms of how many resources students are using. To explore how frequency of use may have differed across demographics, I ran a separate ANOVA model for each of our 34 resources. These models test whether there are significant relationships between dependent variables, which is again our frequency of use here, rated from 1 to 5, and and predictor variables, which are our demographic variables here, again, gender and racial identity, year in program, and college generation status. So overall, I ran 34 separate models, and after adjusting for multiple comparisons, I used Tukey post hoc analyses to look at pairwise comparisons within the significant models. Now, what we found is that all of the demographic factors that we tested were significantly related to the frequency of use for at least one resource. But as we can see, there is one demographic variable that predicted far more resource use outcomes, and that was student racial identity. So today we're going to focus here on what resources differed between white and non-white students in terms of frequency of use. And again, before we do this, I really want to hear from you all. So I want you to brainstorm in the chat and think about what resources may have differed in terms of frequency of use between white and non-white students. To help you, you've got this list of 34 resources here, and take about 30 seconds to predict which resources or which types you think may have differed among students. You've got 30 seconds starting now. Okay, I see a lot of people guessing network resources. I definitely see people guessing social, and I'm wondering if that's not founded on what we see in the literature. Love these hypotheses. All right, so lots of good guesses. Let's see if you were right. So here are our results. Everything that is not grayed out is a resource that was significant in our models. And specifically, every resource written in black text was used significantly more frequently by non-white students compared to white students. We've actually only got one resource here, grants, that was used significantly more frequently by white students compared to non-white students. So the first big thing to note is that a ton of these resources, when we're having these terms, these differences in terms of racial identity, we're seeing that non-white students are using more resources more frequently than white students are. And there are a couple of interesting insights here that I want to point out. So the first is this big list of institutionally provided resources. If you'll remember from earlier in our talk, when we look at students as a monolith, we concluded that these types of resources weren't used very often. However, when we consider demographic factors, what we can see is that non-white students are using these resources significantly more frequently. I'm sure that if I was able to break this down even more, for example, by a more fine scale racial identity, we would be able to see even more interesting patterns. And this just speaks to the importance of not treating our students as a monolith, either when we're advising and mentoring these students or when we're conducting research on them. The other thing that I want to point out is the increased frequency of use of social resources in non-white students. And this is something that some of you guys hypothesized in the chat. These findings support previous literature, which shows that non-white students often lean on their social, cultural, and familial capital to navigate often inequitable systems of higher education. So it's just great to see that our results are aligning with what we see in the literature. So overall, what we can say is that demographics do impact frequency of resource use and the number of resources that students are using. But what about student perceptions of value? So this is data I'm still working on, so I'd love to discuss this all with you at the end of the talk as well. But in this chart, we're going to see the difference in prevalence of those help provided codes among student differences in those demographics. And this is going to show student perception of value for just one resource, and that's advisor. So from left to right, these columns are going to show the difference in code prevalence between first and continuing generation students, between non-white and white students, between students who identify as women and students who identify as men, and then between students in their first 2 years of their program versus the last handful of years in their program. So what we can see is that code prevalence here just doesn't change that much between levels in these demographic factors. The largest percent of difference we see in these codes is a 7% increase, but even that is really not that much in terms of the sample size that we've seen. So I ran chi-squared tests to look at the differences in code prevalence within each characteristics, and none of those tests came back as significant. So overall, what we can say is that there are no significant demographic differences in terms of students' perception of resource value. Now, like I said, this is something that I've just started working on. And one of the issues I'm running into is that our sample sizes are really small when we break it down to this fine of a scale. So for example, there were only 2 students who identified as men who described their advisor in terms of well-being. So this stat that we're looking at here is probably a sample size comparison of 6 women to 2 men. So take these results with a big grain of salt and know that I want to work on them more in the future. But let's think about what we've learned in terms of our third research objectives. We found kind of conflicting results. We found that demographic characteristics are significantly related to the number of resources used and the frequency with which they're used. However, demographic characteristics were not significantly related to students' perceptions of value, at least yet. And I've got some ideas about why we might be seeing these conflicting results. If my slides would advance, there we go. So there may be a type of filtering effect that impacts students' perceptions of value, where students with different perceptions of value don't make it to graduate school or didn't make it into our population for one reason or another. So potentially students do have different perceptions of value, but we're just not picking those up. It also may be that regardless of what you use, you're using it for a really similar reason. So maybe all of the graduate students in our sample have an academic, a support, and a well-being need to fulfill, and students are just using different sets of resources to fulfill these same needs. So we're seeing those same values come up, even though the resources they're using are different. Or like I said before, especially in terms of students' perception of value, the sample sizes I'm working with are super small. So it may be that there is an effect, but we just can't see it yet. And of course, there could certainly be something else that I'm just not aware of yet. So this is something I'd love to talk about with you all. But let's take a second and talk about how we can use these results to best support our graduate students. So first off, our results show that social support is critical to all of our students, and it's especially important for minoritized students. This suggests that advisors and departments should make a concerted effort to build community strength wherever they can, because building that community strength will help all students, and it will especially help our minoritized students. Furthermore, our results show that students use resources to fulfill their very basic needs. However, recent work by Shelley Gaynor and others has revealed that many graduate programs in the United States pay students at far less than a living wage. And this is not groundbreaking news, but graduate students must be able to afford housing and other necessities before they can be productive scholars and researchers. So one way we can increase student persistence and productivity then may be by increasing how much we pay students or enabling them in some other way to meet these basic needs. Our preliminary results also suggest that while students use a huge array of resources, there may be universal reasons why they're using these resources. So with future work to support these claims, I hope that we can begin to reimagine how we support graduate students. So instead of a top-down approach of connecting students to the resources that we think they need, I'd like us to utilize a bottom-up approach when mentoring and talking to students, where we listen to students, understand their current needs, and then work together to find appropriate resources to fulfill those needs, knowing that they may change over time. And finally, knowing that demographics do play a key role in which resources students use, these results suggest that in order to support the widest possible diversity of students, we should provide the largest possible selection of resources. But that resource provisioning decisions should be made using empirical data, not assumptions. So potentially some of those institutionally provided resources that students aren't using very often, some of those resource use decisions might instead be made to allocate towards childcare, university provided childcare, university food pantries, things like that that our students are expressing that they would like to fulfill some of those needs. So overall, these data have been such an exciting launching point into the world of resource use. I hope to continue on into a postdoc and a research position, still answering all of these questions about resource use. And specifically, I plan to pursue future work to investigate how resource use may be related to academic success and to further explore the effect of those demographic factors. And then this wouldn't be a presentation about resource use if I did not acknowledge and thank all of the resources that got me to this point. So I would like to thank members of my lab and my academic committee. I would like to say that my funding is through the Graduate Research Fellowship Program. And of course, I would like to thank everyone from the University of Toronto and CIHE for inviting me here today to share my work with you. So with that, I will say thank you for your attention, and I would love to talk about any of your questions or anything you've got. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maryrose. That was an absolutely amazing presentation. And I think there's lots of clappy hands there. I think I speak for everyone in saying thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah.
We did have some questions come up earlier, so I thought we could maybe go and address those first, and then you can get some of those extra points. People can jump in the chat or put their hand up. And we did have a couple of questions that were basically around the same thing. And it was just taking us back to the start with the top 3 resources. And one of those was separately electronic resources to online journal articles. And the questions were around what do these electronic resources constitute? Are they separate from these online journals? Are they not accessed through the library? Totally. Just a bit more about that, really.
Yes, so those online academic journals, they are, I would find in most graduate programs, often accessed through the library, but I know at least in my experience as a graduate student, my library does not have access to all of those journals. And so those online academic journals, they did not count as an electronic resource. Electronic resources instead were often things like RStudio or SAS or SPSS, those data analysis resources, or word processing software, things like that. And in the survey itself, we did have a little EG and gave examples of electronic resources so students knew what we were talking about. So hopefully that answers that question. Cool.
Thank you. That's brilliant. So I think it was Jason and Catherine both asked that. Do you either of you have any follow-ups with that specifically that you want to ask Maryrose?
So I'll just come off mute really quick. Thank you. No, actually, I actually had a very specific. I was just thinking more so about things like websites as well. So I was actually that's what I was thinking about when I asked the question.
Yeah, so I love that concept of using websites or like Stack Overflow or Reddit or things like that, where students are seeking some of that social support online. That was something we actually didn't have in here in this list of resources. But something else I did want to mention is that we also asked students to write in any resources that weren't encapsulated on that list. That list was created through about 3 rounds of pilot testing within life science graduate students, but we still didn't capture all the resources that students are using. So we actually got about 20 write-in resources that weren't on the list that we're going to incorporate for our next round of testing in graduate students. So good question, Jason. There actually was not an option that really related to those online communities, but that's something that students definitely wrote in that I'm looking to incorporate in the future.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jason. I know Catherine Jansen, she has a question for you here in the chat. Catherine, do you want to ask Maryrose?
Just have to unmute myself. Thank you. That was a great presentation. And you may have mentioned it somewhere, I missed it, but what was your total sample size and how did you go about recruiting your participants, please?
Yeah, great question. Our total sample size was 534 life science graduate students. The sample size for the qualitative piece was a little bit less. It was about 492 because some students didn't answer those free response questions. And of those 534 graduate students, we recruited them using listservs. So email listservs of things like Ecological Society of America, Ecolog, things like that. We distributed the survey on social media. And then finally, probably how I got most of the survey responses was I directly emailed program administrators at probably 130 institutions. And I did that all by hand of looking up department administrators and emailing them specifically with my IRB recruitment information. So it took a lot of work, but I would say that was probably how I got the most of my responses. Yeah.
Terrific. Thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. Catherine, I'm seeing what was my response rate. I could not tell you because we distribute them via these listservs. I'm not sure how many students saw the advertisement in total.
It's fine. You basically snowballed it, so that's fine. I just didn't know if you had gotten like a national stat or something like that we'd be able to know something about that. But how about item response rate? Because you had some great questions.
Yeah, item response rate is a great question. I don't have those stats off the top of my head. The only thing I do know is that the free response sections, like you would see in most surveys, did not get as much response as the other ones. But we only included responses in our data set that we got that were either 94% complete or higher. So 94% just represents that they did not do those free response questions. So I took out any of those partially responded answers.
Great, thank you. This has been a great talk. Thank you.
Oh, great. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Madhvi, I see your hand. Hello.
Hi, Maryrose. Thank you for your talk.
You're welcome.
I don't know if you saw this in any of your qualitative responses, but I was curious for some of those institutional resources, whether they had sort of programming and resources tailored to graduate students. So because of your approach,
Yeah.
you know, obviously it's different at different institutions, but I don't know if you saw like people calling out things that may have felt specific to graduate students in here.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say of the institutional resources, the only ones that students really mentioned that were specifically tailored for graduate students would be those university-sponsored events, which sometimes have, you know, how to wrangle your data, events like that that are specifically for students who are doing research. But I would say one of my instinctual response is that one of the reasons those institutionally provided resources aren't used very often is because they're not tailored for graduate students. But I did not see a ton of callouts of that just because we asked students to choose their top 3 most important resources for the free response. and institutionally provided resources just didn't come up that often. It was much more often those advisors, significant others, things like that. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that answers my question. Because I mean, I could see how in institutions where they have more specific career resources for graduate students that have been developed with that population in mind, or that are sort of tailored by subdiscipline, where resource use would be much higher in those cases than if it's just the general university career center.
Yeah, I would suspect that would be right as well, because just knowing from myself as a graduate student, it doesn't really help me to go to a career center as somebody who's never helped somebody prepare for a tenure track position or things like that, right? So I probably wouldn't use those resources very often myself. Yeah.
Does anybody have any more questions for Maryrose? I know there are a few things that that you wanted to talk about, didn't you, from the presentation?
Yes.
So, I mean, you feel free to, if no one has any questions at the moment, we can have a chat about those.
I mean, yeah, something I would be really, really interested in just picking everybody's brains about is understanding why we might hypothesize that demographic variables didn't come up as significant in terms of value. So that's very interesting to me, just that we're seeing these differences in what students are using, but not why they're using them. Those differences by demographic factors, of course. I don't really get it. I guess that if you use something, you're going to say it's important, and you're going to say it's important for the same reasons, but that's all that I can really think about. But I'd love to know if you all have any insights, if you all think anything different.
The slide again, please.
Yeah.
Yes.
Are you this one or a different one?
Is this the one you're asking us to think with you about?
Yeah, essentially, yeah. Actually, I could do this one. I see a raised hand if you'd like to go.
Yeah, so I work at a writing center about an hour away from Toronto. And one of the things that I'm wondering about is international student status and language. So I think that, I mean, this is completely anecdotal, but graduate students in general, and we have specialized graduate student programming and services in our writing center, have a fairly unified sense of what the needs are and why they are coming to the Writing and Communication Center. But I think international students for whom English is not their first language would probably identify their need for level of service or frequency of use as higher. And that's what we see anecdotally in our writing center.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing to note. And I also wonder if perception of usefulness might be another really interesting variable to look at, and how that might change across demographics. But yeah, something that I wish I would have collected, a demographic characteristic, is that international student status, or even whether or not a student was a transfer student in their undergrad. Things like that, I think, would be really interesting demographic characteristics to also look at. Yeah, good suggestion.
So I think you had International Student Center as one of your different resources, but then you don't know whether the students using it were international students.
Yeah, that's right. Awesome. Well, if there are no other questions, that's okay, or no other hypotheses. This is something that stumps me as well, so that's totally fine. If you all think of anything, or you'd love to discuss anything more with me, I will throw my email back on the screen. And I really, really appreciate your attention today. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Maryrose. Such a great presentation, very engaging, very interesting findings. So thank you so much for sharing with us today.
No problem. Awesome.